Hey everyone, it's good to be back with you. Today I want to share one small change that you can make which will revolutionize your ministry forever. Interested? Back in a moment. How many of you are familiar with the SBA, the Small Business Administration? Some research that they did a number of years ago can really change the way you think about ministry. Now, the Small Business Administration, what does that have to do with church ministry? Well, it could have an insight that will help you in your local ministry today. Here's something that I think might blow your mind. Every year, businesses start, but over 450 million of them fail. In other words, they start, they have a vision, they intend to do great things, and 450 million with an M fail each and every year. I mean, that's pretty shocking. The Small Business Administration thought it was pretty shocking too, so they set about doing research to find out why is it that 40% of them fail the first year? Why is it that 80% are gone within 5 years? And that leaves only 20% of any new businesses that even make it. So they set out and did some research. I mean, their business is loaning money to all these businesses, and if 80% of them are failing, it's really not helping their business much either. They're investing money into failures. So they did a lot of research a number of years ago, and here's what they discovered. The Small Business Administration found that the number one reason that these businesses fail is that the leader of that business never led. Now, isn't that curious? All the research they did finally came down to that conclusion. Over 450 million businesses start and fail. So out of all of that, they learned that the reason that they fail, either in the first year or in the 5 years, is because the leader never led. Now, that really is a surprising idea. But the truth of the matter is that we as pastors don't even understand oftentimes the difference between leading and managing. And there is a massive difference. You as a pastor are called to lead your church, not to manage it. Now, I understand if you're just starting out, especially as a church planter, you're really everything. You're the visionary, you're the bus driver, you're all the rest of it. And some of that is, probably dysfunctional. But ultimately, you're called to be the leader in that group. And if you frankly don't understand what that means, I hope that this podcast will give you some insight into really what that is all about. A number of years ago, I served bivocationally as I was planting our church. And if you are in bivocational ministry, I want to recommend one of our early podcasts to you, about bivocational ministry. I would encourage you to listen to it, because here's what I want to say to you. If you've been in bivocational ministry for more than a year, get out of it. Find a way, whatever it takes, get out of it. Pastors should not be in bivocational ministry for extended periods of time. It is lethal to your church. Your church will never grow until you make the decision to go full time. Now, I share about that in my experience. I've done bivocational ministry for 16 years. I know what I'm talking about. I can tell you that until I cut the cord and went full time, my ministry had no hope of even surviving. Anyway, that's not what we're talking about today. I want to share with you about this aspect of leadership. Leadership or managing. There's a big difference. As I said, a number of years ago, I was in bivocational ministry, and the particular business, I did a number of businesses, but the particular business I was serving in at the time was in advertising. And my job was to go to various small businesses and help them advertise in our publications and online and different things that we were doing. And we returned an investment to them. We were worth the investment. But there was one particular business I went to that illustrates the point. It was a truck business. And this gentleman sold a number of mid-size and heavy trucks. And they were brand new. And he did a pretty good amount of business. He had a reasonable amount of sales. And when I went to visit with him, one of the things that was very strange about him, at least strange to me, was when I met with him, the CEO of his business, his hands were full of grease. And as I got to know him, and he's a good guy, but as I got to know him, I started to see some things that I think have application to the church too. He was always in the office. He was doing book work because they didn't want to hire an accountant. He was always in the garage doing a lot of the mechanical work, even though there were other mechanics there. And he was doing a lot of the sales work. He'd talk to people and recommend trucks, and he was good at it. He'd sell trucks. People knew him by his reputation, knew him by him being around for a long time. He really enjoyed the acclamation that he got from running his business. But he ran his business typically 60, 70 hours a week. And none of his family, they all grew up and they benefited from the money he made, but none of them followed him into the business because they didn't want any part of it. So here was a business that was in some ways successful on a small scale, but had no chance of ever going to the next generation. And I remember having a conversation with me because he expressed his frustration for someone who had been working with him for a number of years. And he expressed the frustration that this person just didn't seem to have the same passion as him. And I said to him, let's just say his name is Tom. I said, Tom, this person doesn't have the same passion as you because it's not his business. When you leave this business, you're going to sell it for a couple of $1 million. You'll be just fine. But when he leaves this business, do you even have a retirement plan? No. Do you even have this in place for employees? No, because we're saving money. He was doing all the managing. He was doing all the work. He was doing half of the mechanics. He was doing everything, and he really was frustrated. He is really a picture, I think, of many pastors. And that's the difference, quite frankly, between leading and managing. One of the ministries that has really had a great influence on me from years ago and even continues to today, I've been spending time going over his materials even the last few weeks, and it's just always a benefit. But it is a ministry called Ministry Institute, and I'll have a link for you in the show notes. Dean Ratke is the one who heads that ministry. He may even be retired by now. I think he's probably in his early 80s, but really a tremendous brother who had a heart to really see pastors released from the day-to-day managing of their church to become the leaders that God wanted them to be. And he uses an illustration that I really think is very powerful, and it's also evergreen, meaning that it always has an impact. In fact, he demonstrated this for us while we were at one of the seminars. I was one of the people selected, but he was up on the stage and he was pretending that he was a conductor and that we all were the orchestra. So he began to conduct us just like a conductor does, and he's showing the stick and everything else. But in the middle of his conducting, he jumps down off the stage. He comes over to me and says, "Hey, you're the tuba player in this orchestra." And he says, "I got to tell you something. Your tuba is just not what it could be. When I need the tuba to be played, I'm going to come down off the stage. I'll just play that little piece of tuba bit that I think could be done a little bit better, and I'll go back up on stage. You can still do the tuba. You'll still get all the credit for being the tuba player. We just want you to be happy in your position. But when that particular part comes in the music that we really need that strong tuba, I'm going to go ahead and take it because I think I can do it a bit better." Then he runs up on stage and he does the same thing again. He runs to the other side of the room and he said, "Listen, you're the flute player and I like your flute playing, but it really isn't what it should be. So I'm going to just, at this particular time in the orchestra, when it's playing this certain music, I'm going to just come in and just do a little bit of flute for you." And he does the same thing with the cymbal players, and he does the same thing with one other person who's playing. And he goes through this exercise, and we're all kind of watching him, wondering what he's doing. And in the middle of the presentation, he stopped and he says, "Look up on stage." So we all looked up on stage, and he said, "What do you see?" And we all said, "There's nobody there." And he said, "Now you got it." He says, "As long as you're not leading your church, but trying to do everyone else's job, there's no leader. And because there's no leader, the music will never play correctly." There's a lot that he had to say about that, and I won't be able to spend time unpacking all of it. But quite frankly, as pastors, we know we can do all of those instruments better than everybody else. In fact, we may not admit it, but we really believe that. We believe that we can do just about everything better than everybody else. And oftentimes when we get frustrated that things aren't being done the way they should be, we end up taking on those responsibilities. I'll never forget a pastor from Maine years ago, and was just asking him about his job, and he was bivocationally delivering pizzas. And I thought to myself, what a crazy idea. Here's a guy who's pastoring a church, trying to get it going, and he's delivering pizzas all over town. And he began to describe for me his day. And most of his day was going to church members and essentially begging them to come back to church. "I know that you weren't there Sunday. I just wanted to visit with you." So it was a visit with all these old ladies, and he begged them to come back to church. And I said, what a waste of life. But he's representative of many pastors. We spend a lot of our time doing things that have nothing to do with leading. Now, we know from the New Testament that this is one of the problems the apostles encountered early on. They were serving tables. Now, there's something very good and noble about serving tables, but even as they're doing it, there's complaints happening. It's not even being done properly. As hard as they were working, they couldn't get those tables served properly, and there were widows that were fighting because of race issues and all kinds of things that were going on at that time. You know the story. Eventually, they had to select 7 men, and they selected men who were filled with the Holy Spirit and wisdom to take care of that business. I'm convinced that those 7 men did not do all that work. I believe they managed a team of people who ended up doing that work. So finally, those widows were properly served, and I'll bet there were probably 30, 40, or 50 people taking care of that. The apostles said what? We need to give ourselves to prayer and to the word. And for most of us who are pastors, that's a challenge because we don't think of that as work, and we're kind of afraid that other people won't think of it as work either. I found it interesting, and one of the things that Dean Radke says in his training presentation is when he approached or when he looked into or researched people who are the top millionaires or billionaires in our world, they said the same thing. They spend 50% of their time, think about this, these are the guys who have the biggest corporations, they have the greatest organizations with literally tens of thousands of people working under them. They spend 50% of their time thinking. And these are secular people. These are not people who are thinking about how to expand the kingdom of God. They're thinking about how to expand their business. But 50%, half of their day is spent simply thinking. I also find it interesting as you look through the Old Testament that God called Levites to serve in the temple. And when you really look at their schedules, most of them served 2 weeks out of a year in the temple. There were a lot of other things they did. I'm sure they did counseling and various other things, but the Levites had a lot of time to study the word, to commune with God, and to get the vision. Now, the vision had already been established by Moses, so it was, in that sense, a very easy job for them as far as that's concerned. But you as a pastor, you really need time to hear from God. You need time to be intimate with God, to be intimate with your family, to make sure that your family's together. So many pastors lose their families because they're dedicated to another mistress, and the mistress is the ministry. Well, God hasn't called you to make your ministry into a mistress. You've got one mate, that's your spouse. And so I just want to encourage you today that there's a difference between leading and managing. And as long as you're spending time doing what everyone else is supposed to do and not finding ways to train them to do it, you're not even discipling them. What did Jesus give us as the final instructions? Go and disciple nations. You're called, pastor, and so am I, to train people to do the work of ministry. You and I are called to show people how to do it, but not to do the work for them. You're not supposed to be the bus driver. You're not supposed to be the Sunday school teacher. You're not supposed to be all of these things. And I don't mean just the difficult jobs. I mean everything. You ought to be training people to be preachers and teachers. You ought to be training people to do the work of ministry. Otherwise, what happens to your church when you pass away or when you retire? Does it continue, or does it just completely depend on you? You're not called to do all the things that you think you're called to do. The main job that you're called to do is to lead. So I hope this has been an encouragement to you. Before we go, I do want to mention to you that there's a couple things that you can find at ministerstoolbox.com. I mentioned the link for Ministry Institute. I encourage you to interact with that ministry. Got some great materials there for you. I also wanted to share a couple of videos with you from Zimbabwe. I continue to hear from them and the progress that's going on with the wells. If you're in any way interested in that project, I just want to share with you some of the things that are going on there. So take advantage of that by going to ministerstoolbox.com as well. And also, if you're interested in any of the books that I've had the privilege to write, I talk about spiritual abuse in one of my books. I talk about the Titanic. I talk about foundations. There's a variety of different books that address subjects that I think would help your church. You can find that also, and I'll have a link for you at ministerstoolbox.com. But before we go, as always, I end each podcast with a quote, especially for you. And this one is from Tom Peters, who said, "Leaders don't create followers. They create more leaders." True enough. Till next time. Hey, before you go, can you please leave me a comment? like and subscribe, I would greatly appreciate it.